good lead into our next speaker. We just mentioned wet weather, and a major concern with wet weather is plant disease. So we have with us Ann Gould is our extension specialist in plant pathology, and she's going to talk about common diseases of ornamentals, symptoms, signs, and management. Ann teaches 3 undergraduate plant pathology courses, and she also works very closely with the nursery and bedding plant industry, doing educational programs and providing technical support. So welcome in.
You have to hold it up here?
Hold it pretty close, just
Oh my gosh. You know what this means, don't you? It means I can't walk around and I can't wave with my hands. I'm also going to have to point to the screen, so if I'm off camera, you know what it is with looking at pictures of diseased plants, how you kind of need to point to stuff? So I'm not sure how that's going to work. Do I have a pointer here? Can you see that? Oh, all right, that works. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me today. How many of you have encountered plant diseases in your everyday growing situation? So most of you are kind of familiar with what the concept of plant disease is all about. What plant disease really is a relationship between a host plant and an organism that's trying to get to that host plant and use it for food. So you can kind of think of it in very, very simple, thanks, you just threw me off. Simple terms as kind of a relationship where one wants food and the other one doesn't want it to have it. And this little dance or this little fight goes back and forth between them, and the process evolves and everybody changes from mutation through an evolutionary process, and you just end up with these organisms that live together. Sometimes the relationship is very mild, where the organism that causes disease gets what it needs without causing too much damage to the plant. And other times the damage to the plant is so severe that we have epidemics and we lose plant material in the environment. What's really important in this little relationship or dance is the environment, and it's really the environment that drives the disease process, and it also drives the management process as well. And as we go through this very brief talk today, we'll talk a little bit about how the environment impacts disease development. Now, diseases are caused by many different kinds of agents. Most of the time when we think of a disease agent, we think of a fungus or a bacterium or a virus. These organisms affect humans and animals. Some of them also affect plants. But a lot of agents that cause disease are not living, and we might consider these to be environmental stresses, such as too much moisture or not enough, air pollution, de-icing salts, pH issues, nutritional issues. Those are diseases as well. What you need to remember is that diseases violate your expectations. So if something doesn't look quite right, there's a good chance that it falls into this living category or this non-living category, and it's a disease. We have to remember that diseases cause injury, they're progressive, they change over time, and they're extremely complex and challenging. And diagnostics, which is one of the most important things that we as plant pathologists do, is one of the hardest things that we have to do. But we have to make sure we've got a good diagnosis for a plant disease, otherwise we don't have the information we need to manage it. Now, the definition of plant disease excludes insects. Insects do cause injury. Sometimes they are progressive. But insects are important in the plant disease process because oftentimes they are what we call vectors of plant disease. In other words, they take the organisms that cause disease and they move them from one plant to the next. So insects cause injury, but not usually disease. This is a memory aid that all plant pathologists use. It's the disease triangle. And basically what it tells you is that diseases only develop when we have a susceptible host in the vicinity of an organism that can use that host for food. Space and time, they're together. And then there are environmental conditions that drive the disease process. And the most common environmental condition that drives the process is moisture. Because we're dealing with living organisms here, moisture is important for both growth and development and spread of the disease agents, and it's also important for the growth and the development and defense mechanisms that plants have as well. So managing diseases is actually pretty simple. All you have to do is remove one of the 3 vertices of the triangle. It looks simple, right? We might want to plant a resistant host, for instance. That would be very helpful for disease management. We may want to use a compound or a chemical that kills or interferes with the penetration process. or the food gathering process of that disease agent on that host, or we may want to change environmental conditions that make it really lousy for the pathogen or for the organism that's causing the disease, or really, really good for the defense mechanisms of the host. So in a nutshell, we've just talked about what I talk about in class for about, 3 weeks? Yeah, okay. All right. So today I'm going to talk about some below ground things and a couple of above ground things. Do you actually have any idea of how many ornamentals are grown in the state of New Jersey? Madeline, do you know?
A lot.
A lot, yeah. And all of them get a disease of one kind or another. So what I'm going to do today is I just picked 3 things that I think are important. And I'm going to use these to illustrate some of the things that I want you to know. So one of the things that you need to know coming off the top is that every part of a plant is capable of getting some kind of a disease. So flowers can be affected, or stems can be affected, or roots. And the function of that plant often tells you the symptom that you might expect to see from that disease process. So for instance, if you destroy the roots, then moisture doesn't move through the plant. If moisture doesn't move through the plant, then what symptom do we often see? Wilting and scorching and that kind of thing. There's a lot of ways that roots are affected, or the vasculature is affected by both environment and by organisms, but the end result is just about the same. So that's why diagnostics are so important. All right, so root disease. All right, let's look at this puppy. What's wrong with this picture? We pulled this holly out of a pot. What do you see? We see plant material on the top. That's right, I'm not supposed to be interactive, am I? We have plant material on the top that's light green, as if it has a nutrient deficiency, and then down below we have darkened roots in sort of a pattern. Do you see the dark roots on the bottom and the lighter roots on the top? This is indicative of a plant that had been sitting in too much water in the pot. The point here is that we've looked at the entire plant, we see symptoms above ground and below ground, and from here we can make our diagnosis and move forward. Root diseases in general are caused by soil-borne organisms. In other words, these organisms produce spores and live and grow in the soil. Plants are exposed to these organisms when grown in contaminated soil, or when irrigation water that contains these organisms comes into contact with the plants. Root diseases are characterized as root, crown, and stem rots, or we can get rots of propagative plant parts such as cuttings and bulbs, and then also something called damping off, and I'll show you pictures of these in just a minute. Root conditions are often troublesome when growing conditions are too wet. When you think about it, plants that are too wet, they're growing in soil that doesn't have enough oxygen, so the plants are not doing very well, but also these organisms like to move around and much more easily when there's water moving through the soil profile. All right, common symptoms of root disease include moisture stress, wilt, nutrient stress, loss of color, and lack of biomass on the roots as well. And I'll show you pictures in just a second. All right. So where does the source of disease for root disease come from? It comes from contaminated soil, irrigation water, and this is really important. It often comes also from plant material produced elsewhere that has disease. So one of the management strategies we always talk about when you're farming or growing or just a homeowner and bringing material into your landscape is to take a good look at it. Look at it for insects and disease, in other words, scout. That's a very, very important plant concept to get into keep it in your mind, because if you take plant material that has a problem and you move it into your landscape, you've moved that problem into your landscape as well. All right, so let's look at some examples. What's happening here? If you take a good look at this flat, the first thing you might notice is there's no plant there where there should be. Oftentimes growers, this is the first thing they see, is they'll see a flat that might not look so bad. It looks a little off color, maybe the blossoms don't look very good, but it's missing a plant or two. So these are the plants that you might want to investigate. The missing plant is the first clue. Second thing you need to do when you're thinking about root disease is to pull the plant out of the rooting media and take a good look. So here's an example here of a root rot, and what I want you to notice here is, do you see the, we do this? All right, do you see these white roots here? Can you see that? Yeah, all right, now do you see the brown roots? Now, is the entire root brown? The root ball brown? No, just a little bit of it. So wherever the organism was, that's causing the disease, wherever it got in and started to use the plant for food, that's where the browning occurs. So root rots are easily diagnosed in early stages when you have roots that are nice and healthy, interspersed with those that are not. If you want to go ahead and look at this one here, do you see the pattern here where the roots on the bottom don't look so good and the roots on top look much better? This would be an example of environmental stress where most of the roots are affected by one given individual issue. And in this case, there was so much water in the bottom of this pot, or the pot was, the drainage hole was plugged up, that all the roots that didn't get enough oxygen turned brown, and the ones up at the top did not. So these are just some of the things to look for when you're looking at root disease. All right, here's another example of root disease. This one looks pretty bad, doesn't it? In this case, this one has been attacked by a very, very common soil-borne organism called Pythium, and you'll see Pythium written about in your travels as you go through looking up problems with plant material. But sometimes these organisms will chew away at the cortex or the outer layer of cells and just leave the vascular bundle behind, and that's another very, very common symptom that we see with root disease. This is an example of another kind of root disease. This is the labiopsis or black root rot on pansy, which is a very, very common problem in the state of New Jersey right now. What I want you to notice is above ground, what does it look like? A little bit cupping, right? A little bit off color, a little bit of wilt, doesn't look so good. You wouldn't know why that plant looked that way until what? You pulled it out of the pot and looked at the roots. And what do the roots look like? They're blackened, they're darkened, lack of biomass here. So this is a really good, again, a really nice way of diagnosing this root disease. But with root diseases, it's always important to look at what? The entire plant. It's very important. Okay. This is an example of damping off. For any of you that raise seeds in flats, when our rooting medium becomes contaminated with soil that contains soil-borne organisms, they will attack the seedlings before they come out of the ground. And this is called pre-emergence damping off. You can kind of see this area up here. There should have been seeds there and there aren't. And then sometimes then what happens is as the seeds come up, they are also attacked. And then once they're attacked, they flop over and actually don't look very good, as you can see here. That's called post-emergence damping off. This is another example of a root issue, only this one attacks seeds by some of the same organisms that attack more mature plants. Cutting rots will extend from the cut end up the stem, as you can see here. So the organism was, these plants were stuck into potting or rooting media that was contaminated with soil-borne organisms, and the disease organism, Okay, thank you. The disease organism went marching right up to the top. Oh, and you're going to take this bulb and put it in your garden? No, absolutely you're not. So this is really interesting. This is a propagative plant part, and this is a really easy way of moving plant diseases from one place to the next. We have a bulb here that has brown discoloration associated with the disease. It also has lots of fluffy fungal material that you can see here as well. Okay, so patterns matter. As you can see here on the flat on the left, do you see how we have a focus or a group of plants in the center that are all wilted and don't look very good? Oftentimes, root diseases in landscapes and in the field and also in the greenhouse follow moisture patterns. In this case, the ones on the left were sitting on the floor of the greenhouse or the nursery where it was too wet and there was puddling there, and those wet moisture conditions are really conducive to disease. And over on the right side here, you can kind of see little patches of diseased plant material here where the disease spreads from one little seedling to the next. These are things that we always look for when we're thinking about root disease in lots of different kinds of situations. So management is pretty tricky for root diseases. Once they're established, they're very hard to control, so an accurate diagnosis is key. Prevention is key. Also, sanitation is needed. Sanitation, you may already know what that term means, but for us it means those labor-intensive things that you do that help to keep levels of inoculum or levels of disease-causing organisms down to a manageable level. We're always looking to keep our levels of inoculum or levels of organisms down to a level that's below your economic threshold. It's pretty important. Maintain healthy plants. That helps to keep plants healthy. When they're healthy, they defend themselves well. Use resistant plant material. Regularly inspect for diseases and insects in greenhouses and nurseries. Don't move infested soil around. Careful water and nutrient management is important. And then combine any chemicals that you might use, whether they're inorganic or organic compounds. Use them in conjunction with cultural practices, and the cultural practices keep our level of organisms low so our products have an opportunity to work. Okay, so above ground, let's talk a little bit about Boxwood Blight. Boxwoods, you guys like boxwoods? The demand for boxwoods is high. It actually exceeds azaleas, hollies, hydrangeas, and arborvitae. So they're very, very popular, and we have a pretty serious disease in the trade at this point called Boxwood Blight. There's no suitable resistance in Buxus to this pathogen that causes Boxwood Blight. It is a fungus. Very susceptible are the ones that everybody grows, which are English and American boxwoods, as well as some other ones. It was introduced to Connecticut in 2011, probably from infected nursery stock from Europe. So what does this look like? These are went too fast. These are above ground symptoms that we see associated with this disease, but a lot of diseases affect foliage as well. So here we have our brown lesions on the leaves. Do you see those? And a little bit of yellowing. And what happens with boxwood blight is these will coalesce into larger areas of blight on the leaves, and then the leaves will turn tan and drop. And then with this disease, there's a very characteristic black streak along the stem. Boxwoods for the Plant Diagnostic Laboratory for this past year exceeded any other plant disease issue that the Plant Diagnostic Laboratory had this year. And then eventually the plants will defoliate and die. So you will come across this whether you're a homeowner or you're going to go into the ornamentals industry. You'll see a lot of these as you go forward. What's very interesting about this disease is that during humid weather, little white clusters of spores or the sign of the disease will be apparent on the stems and under the leaves, and that's one of the ways you can tell you have this disease. You see these little white clusters here and here, and this is a close-up under the microscope. So management is preventive to keep boxwood blight out of production areas, especially our historic gardens, and that's where everybody has a lot of issues. Keys are sanitations, good pruning, ground cover management using resistant or tolerant cultivars. And right now for new plantings, several different kinds of boxwoods have been identified that have relative susceptibility, meaning they're not as bad as the other ones, but they're definitely not resistant to the disease. And I understand you have a copy of this presentation already available to you, so you can go back and read some of these later. And then finally, I want to finish up with cankers. I have probably more questions about cankers than almost anything else. What is a canker? A canker is just a lesion on a stem. It can be a hard stem or a soft stem, herbaceous or woody. And basically, it's just a lesion where an organism has gotten in through a wound or natural opening on the stem, grown through the cambium or the bark layer, and using it for food. And as it does, it tends to kill the tissue. So here you can see a sunken elliptical lesion that we call a canker, and this one entered the stem of this plant. This is an amelanchier through these improper pruning wounds. So pruning is pretty important. Symptoms: cankers destroy vascular tissue, so you end up with vascular dysfunction, such as dead or dying branches, wilt, scorch, and then one of the things that you want to look at when you think about cankers is that the branches dispersed throughout the canopy basically occur wherever there is an organism that's using that branch for food. So it doesn't tend to cluster. The branches don't cluster around the canopy of a tree. Pathogen enters through wounds, other openings, usually at a branch stub, expands in all directions from the point of entry. And then what these organisms also do is they produce fruiting bodies, and these are little structures that support the development of spores in that tissue during favorable weather. Most cankers develop on plants weakened or stressed by moisture extremes, especially drought. It was interesting to see that the weather patterns have changed in New Jersey from all those extended periods of drought that we had 10 years ago now to extended wet periods. But these also predispose plants to canker development. So here's a couple of pictures here. This one on the left is an annual canker Can you see the edge of the canker here? So the organism penetrated the tissue here. These were a bundle of whips in the nursery that had been tied together by a little rope, and wherever the rope touched those nice succulent whips, it caused a wound. And when they were laid out or lined out in the nursery in wet weather, there were organisms around that got in and started using it for food. This here is an example of what we call a perennial canker. This is Nectaria, which is one of the most common cankers. Perennial meaning that the canker develops the first year, and then it develops again more the following year and more the next year, and then you end up with these layers of callus. Do you see the layers of callus? Okay, all right. So I guess I need to take questions now, so thank you very much. I didn't think that was too bad. I got almost through the whole thing, yeah. Okay. Do boxwood mites carry boxwood blight? And the answer is no. Who was that? That was you. All right, that's a separate issue. I do not believe that insects are at all involved in boxwood blight. Okay. The second question, how can you eradicate allium white rot? And I do not know. Was that, whose question was that?
Over so we can see you on the camera.
Oh, you can't see me.
And we have a computer question for you too.
Okay.
So if you just
There was a mold on a sunflower field last year. Will it stay in the soil and contaminate the next crop? That was probably, what, downy mildew maybe? Maybe, or it could have been powdery mildew. It kind of depends on the type of mold. See, mold is not a very scientific term, so when you get a diagnostic and they call it a mold, it's usually either a powdery mildew or a downy mildew, and those are different classes of organisms. And some do survive year to year, others do not. So without a diagnosis, I can't answer that one either. What else? Is there anything else?
No. Do we have any other questions from Ann from Roselander Mays Landing? Any other questions here in New Brunswick?
I don't know, was it fun? It was fun for me? Okay. All right, good.